Hello, everyone. Welcome to another edition of Secret Society Exploration with WarHamster Brady. How are you today, Brady?
I'm doing great, Colonel. How are you?
I'm awesome.
You are awesome. This should be a fun one. We missed it last week. Both of us had some crazy conflicts, so it's good to be back in the saddle with you. And
Yep.
good to jump into the Roosevelt and Delano families. So that should be fun. You ready to go?
Yes, I'm ready.
How about if I share my screen? Okay. We are going through, of course, scroll and key, and we're going through the 1890s. Last week we talked about the Vanderbilt family. 2 weeks ago we talked about the Vanderbilt family, but the other name in 1895, Cornelius Vanderbilt's classmate, was a William Adams Delano, class of 1895. When you start talking about the Delanos, we are talking about old money. You know, Vanderbilt's were new money, and the Delanos were, oops, get out of there. Delanos were very old money. So we're going to tell their story, and there are a lot of very interesting characters that happen to kind of fit into our overall theme about how the world really runs. So with no further ado, let me skip over there. Okay. I navigate this very messy mirror board. The Delanos. And let's get them up there so we can see a little bit. We're going to go through every single person on this family tree.
No,
I'm kidding. They've been here a long time. So it's a very, very widespread family, the Delanos. So how did they get there? There's not going to be pictures of everyone there because they go back a long time. We'll start with a guy by the name of Philip Delanois. Now, of course, that would be anglicized to Delano. He is born, no picture, in Leiden. And so I'll go back up to here so we have something to look at. I'm making everyone dizzy.
Yes.
That's too blurry. Okay. He's born in a place called Leiden, 1603, the Spanish Netherlands, which is now part of northern France. He would sail to the Plymouth colony in 1621, so just after the Mayflower. He has 6 children with his first wife, 3 more with his second wife. His 6th child, Jonathan, marries a daughter of the Mayflower passenger Richard Warren. And some of the famous descendants of this family, there's a lot of them, but Laura Ingalls Wilder, the author, President Ulysses Grant, Calvin Coolidge, president. Of course, we'll get to Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He's one of the descendants. This one family has 3 presidents of the United States. So they're basically telling the Bushes to hold my beer. A couple other descendants were astronaut Alan Shepard and a journalist named Hunter S. Thompson. You can tell by the last names, this is a very widespread family tree, but they spread throughout the colonies. The next important name we have is a guy by the name of Amasa Delano, and he's born in 1763, so about 2 generations later. He's a master mariner and a shipbuilder and an author. So this whole family's got a seafaring background, and that's important. You know, what's one of our themes? That a lot of Americans are built on piracy, a lot of American fortunes. How much you want to bet? How much you want to bet that comes up today?
I know it will. Let me also point out in Anthony Sutton's book on FDR, he traced the Delano family back to 600 BC to a Roman family. So just to put that in context, he also, since you mentioned the presidencies, said that the Delano side is related to John Adams, James Madison, John Quincy Adams, William Henry Harrison, Zachary Taylor, Andrew Johnson, Ulysses S. Grant, Benjamin Harris, and William Howard Taft.
This is old money. These are the blue bloods. You mentioned the Roman stuff. That's one of the theories of history we haven't talked too much about, but they talk about the black nobility. These are the 13 families that came out of Venice. Well, the people who basically settled Venice are the old Roman dynasty aristocratic families. So we can't trace it perfectly. Obviously, it's not. A lot of documentation was lost, but that's definitely a historical fact. And they've got a lot in common. These maritime empires. I just pulled up a little chart of. I basically asked Grok or ChatGPT. I go, give me the list of the most powerful navy in the world from each time period, and you just follow it from Rome to Venice to England. A little stop in the Netherlands along the way. And what do we have? A Dutch family. So yeah, it's very possible. And a lot of the Venetian merchant princes would marry into European nobility. At the first, when they always wanted to get to a place where they couldn't be invaded by land. They first went to the Netherlands. That's why you got the Dutch East India Company, was the king of the seas for a while. And then eventually, when William of Orange gets to England, the British become the most powerful navy in the world. So there's a direct correlation to this. So good point. So Amasa Delano, no picture. He rose from a sailor to captain, engaged in a bunch of trading voyages. He was in the seal industry, which is pretty brutal. And there's a fun story about him. He was off the coast of Chile, and they came upon a Spanish schooner where the slaves had revolted. And apparently his crew were able to free the crew of the Spanish schooner. And the slaves got punished pretty bad. But that's a pretty fun story. It's a lot more detailed than that, but it's a little off topic. All right. So are we ready to get to someone good?
Yes.
Not quite yet. There's a Paul Delano, 1775 to 1842. Remember I told you Amasa was off the coast of Chile?
Right.
Well, Paul Delano, who's either a brother or cousin, was the commander of the Chilean Department of the Navy. And he moved to Chile as the captain of a ship called the Curiacio in 1819. And his son Paul would also be a captain for the Chilean Navy. And he would build the first wharf and the first lighthouse at a port in Valparaiso, Chile. But that really shows you how big of a trading maritime empire the Delanos had at such an early time period. Kind of sets the stage for everything in our foreign policy in Central and South America that would start taking place 40 or 50 years later.
Right.
Okay, give me 1 second.
It also goes to the heart of all of the imperialism that was taking place and how they deposit children along the way that becomes institutional to these countries so that they work from the inside out.
Yeah, very much so. It really they're setting the tone for what becomes their whole regime change stuff. You get your trading interest in the ports. You start influencing the government. This is right in the middle of the industrialization of America is just starting, and we've quickly becoming the massive wealth expansion in America is underway at this point in time.
Right.
And a lot of it's done by these families that are doing the international shipping business, which we talked about quite a bit with the Vanderbilts.
And control of the ports.
Now we get to a really fun gentleman who hasn't talked about enough in history, but he should be. Okay. This gentleman, his name is Columbus Delano. We get him up on screen. There's Columbus. Let's get a little bit better. There we go. Kind of looks like a little bit of that Abraham Lincoln look, huh?
He looks exactly like Abraham Lincoln. That's exactly what I was thinking.
Okay. Why is he important? He was a statesman, a lawyer, a rancher, and a banker. A U.S. congressman from Ohio. He was one of the cousins. He was congressman 3 different times. Here's where it's fun. He is a Whig, the predecessor of the Republican Party. And he's part of the faction that opposed the spread of slavery into the Western territories. The next few weeks, we're going to be talking a lot about the Civil War period. And this is kind of a big deal. You'd say, oh, these guys opposed slavery. Well, no, they were called what you call free staters. Free soil. It was the name of their theme. And they didn't oppose slavery so much as they didn't want to have any blacks in the states that they settled. They were racist. They go, we don't want to even have a slave in our state. And that's why they opposed slavery, these free staters. And that was a big problem with the Whig party splitting. The radical Republicans had abolitionists, pure abolitionists. They wanted to get rid of slavery, but not necessarily for the reasons that sound as pure as they are. And we're going to get into that in the next couple of weeks. So keep that in mind when you hear about these opposing slavery. There's a lot more to that story than meets the eye. You know, we're taught that, oh, the Republicans ended slavery. They're the good guys. Yeah, that's a little more nuanced than that. Fair enough?
Yes.
So the Whig Party fades in the 1850s, and he becomes a Republican at the very founding of the Republican Party, 1854. He's a delegate at the Chicago Republican Convention, and he's the guy that seconded the nomination for none other than Abraham Lincoln at the convention. That tells you where he's a radical Republican, and I'll go into more detail about that in a couple of weeks, or over the next couple of weeks. But that's not a compliment when it comes from me, because I've actually read the real history. So during the Reconstruction period after the war, Lincoln's gone. He's a big advocate for the Black civil rights, and he's one of the people that pushed for the 14th Amendment, which is good and bad, because they shoved 3 amendments into one. And the good part, which is advocating for Black civil rights, is sometimes overshadowed by some of the other things that are in that ridiculous amendment that almost rewrote the Constitution. He's also an opponent of the KKK. I think that's checkmark in the good spot. He was known as a radical Reconstructionist. What that means is they wanted to use the army to impose their will on the conquered southern states. Lincoln was for a much kinder Reconstruction. The radical Reconstructionists kind of got their way. And basically the South for 20 plus years were living under military occupation. That's what he was for. So we'll put that check mark down on the bad side. Fair enough?
Yep.
Yeah, he argues that the former Confederate states be administered by the federal government until they met certain requirements for readmission. He argues that Andrew Johnson didn't have the authority to establish the civil government in all the states. He said only Congress could do that. So that was a bit of a separation of powers battle. He's running for re-election in Congress in 1866, and apparently he lost. Watch this. He appeals and contests George W. Morgan's victory and ends up getting the seat that he had lost by challenging an election. He was an election denier. Yeah, he goes back in office and serves the rest of the term. So Ulysses S. Grant becomes the president in 1868. I'm going to go back to that election denier. How come nobody brought that up, in 2020? It's not the first time. You're allowed to ask questions. Next time someone calls me an election denier, I'm going to have a whole bunch of new facts to throw at them. How did our audience like that? When did we get a couple laughs out of that?
Yes.
Good. Okay. So he's not done yet. So Grant, who's a distant relative, becomes the president, and he appoints Mr. Columbus Delano as the first Secretary of the Interior. I'm sorry, who's the commissioner? There he is. He's the Commissioner of Internal Revenue first. So he tries to tax alcohol and tobacco products from Indian Territory. He's trying to raise more taxes. This is a really great story. You had to pay taxes, sin taxes, if you're in the States. But what would happen is you'd you'd grow your tobacco or manufacture alcohol in Indian territory. You don't have to pay any tax on it. Then you'd smuggle it into the state and sell it tax free. So this is early organized crime, and it's happening under the radical Republican watch, which is going to become a recurring theme in the next few weeks. This leads to what's called the Whiskey Ring from 1871 to 76. And this is basically diversion of tax revenues, a conspiracy among government agents, politicians, whiskey distillers, and distributors to evade taxes. They are bribing government agents. Organized crime, right?
Yep.
This guy's the Commissioner of Internal Revenue, and it's going on under his watch. They are bribing his Treasury agents. Grant's Department of Justice finally prosecuted some of his fellow Republicans, but Delano did absolutely nothing. It happened under his watch. So, what are the odds he was in on the deal? It's never been accused. It's never been reported. But, Mr. See No Evil. We'll see what else we know about him. So then he becomes Secretary of the Interior. This is the 1870s, and we've got massive, rapid westward expansion. There's conflicts with the Indian tribes. So Columbus Delano issues a report. He says, the nomadic lifestyles of Indians will lead to war and their own impoverishment, so we should force them onto small reservations. And the U.S. would take their land while they're assimilated into white society. Part of the way he did this is under his order, we had the slaughter of vast buffalo herds, almost to the point of extinction. Almost 4.4 million buffaloes were slain. And the only places the buffalo were allowed to roam was Yellowstone Park. And interestingly enough, he was the guy who supervised the expedition into Yellowstone in 1871 and became America's first national park overseer. Requested that Congress protect Yellowstone. In 1872, Grant issues an executive order to implement the first Civil Service Commission's recommendations. The Civil Service Commission was trying to put in rules to stymie the corruption that was going on in government. The government is really corrupt under Grant. Most historians are going to agree on that point. But his own Interior Department was corrupt through the spoils system. What is a spoils system? Basically, he who wins collects the spoils. And what it basically is, it's political favoritism. Any party in power grants their cronies, better positions, better contracts with the government. That is the government corruption, and it has basically been formalized. It's what Alexander Hamilton argued for when they talk about federally funded internal improvements. That money is going to go to people who supported the politicians. That's your spoils system. And yeah, we live under it today. But it was a problem even in 1870. Grant, his cousin, demands his resignation because he would not put through the reforms that the Civil Service Commission wanted. And his reputation is tarnished. That's why we don't hear about him too much. But he then returns to Ohio to practice law and raise livestock until his death in 1896. So Columbus Delano, people. Got anything you want to add?
No.
All right. Next guy we're going to look at is this is Captain Warren Delano Sr. I put him in there because he was a seafaring man. He's not all that interesting. What gets interesting is his son.
That's
Warren
the one
Delano.
I want to talk about.
Yep, Warren Delano Jr.
Yep.
Buckle your seatbelts. So he's born in 1809 in New Bedford, Massachusetts. His family already had some standing. And of course, he is the grandfather of Franklin Delano Roosevelt.
Yep.
He's the oldest son of Captain Warren Delano Sr. He marries Catherine Robbins Lyman, and they have 12 children. A couple of their children are interesting. There was Deborah Petty Delano, who would marry into the Forbes family. She marries William Howell Forbes, very old family. And when he dies, she marries his brother, Paul Revere Forbes. Keep it in the family, huh?
Yep.
He's also got one of his children, and we'll get into more detail on, is Sarah Ann Delano. And also he's the father of Warren Delano IV, but we'll get there. So Warren Delano Jr. gets into the import business at age 17. So it puts us at about 1826. So this guy was a Scottish merchant named William Jardine, who introduced the smuggling of opium at a large scale into Chinese products. Go ahead.
Well, Jardines was one of the families, along with the Tata family, that basically took the Indian grown opium and force fed it into China, resulting in the two Boxer Wars. So this is huge.
Yeah. Well, Delano goes to China and he's working for an American company that's doing that, called Russell and Company, who had pioneered the American-China trade. Where have we heard of Russell and Company before?
Remind everybody.
Remember way back, everybody, we talked about the Russell Trust, which is the trust that manages the money for a group called Skull and Bones.
Yes.
And one of the founders of Skull and Bones was a Russell.
Yes.
Well, Delano's there working for that company.
Correct. In opium.
Oh, yeah. No, they called it the tea trade. Because
shipping
this is about
opium into China.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting how they did that. And we'll get there in a second. But I want to make the point is we talk about how these American dynasties are built on piracy and smuggling, whether it be Atlantic slave trade, sugar smuggling, all of it. That's how they made their fortunes. But they still had to have these pristine reputations.
Correct.
So it's the tea trade.
So it's like the CIA front companies of today. Go ahead.
It's like how do you whitewash mafia money?
Yes.
So the way this works is a guy by the name of John Perkins Cushings. He was working with the largest Chinese Hong merchants. And what they do is they'd establish these floating offshore warehouses. So the ships would come up from India, stop at the warehouse, offload the opium, and then continue up the Pearl River Delta to Canton with the legitimate cargo. In the meantime, the Hongs would bring the opium into the mainland. And they get so many and the reason they're doing this is Chinese goods are in such demand in Europe, whether it be China, tea, especially silk. And the only thing the Chinese really wanted was from the West was silver. That was their currency. And that's how we got that. We talked about this when we did talk about the banks way back when. All the silver shipping from South America into China, big business. And England's solution to that is we'll just get everyone hooked on opium. So now there's something else we can, we were losing money on every shipment because Chinese goods were too expensive and ours was too cheap. So now they gave them something the Chinese people wanted by getting them addicted to opium. And as the Colonel mentioned, the opium wars were basically destroyed China's. China was probably the biggest economy in the world. This destroyed them. So by 1843, Warren Delano Jr. is the head partner of Russell and Company. They had destroyed the Canton trading system and they humiliated the Chinese government. So it comes back to America, much, much wealthier. And with his brother Franklin and a guy by the name of Asa Packer. You ever heard of Asa Packer?
Yes.
This guy, he founded Lehigh Valley Railroad and Lehigh University. What they did is they bought several thousand acres and established a town called Delano, Pennsylvania, named him after himself. We get to 1857. And it's something called the Panic of 1857. Bank panics, like a run on the banks. And remember, this is 1857, right before the Civil War. It's caused by, and what happens when you get a Great Depression? You get political shifts, you get political turmoil. So that's why this is important. The Panic of 1857 is caused by a declining international economy and the overexpansion of the domestic economy. What that really means is that these federally funded internal improvements are printing money we don't have, and we grew too fast, and there just wasn't enough. Nothing. The underlying loans did not have enough capital to support them. It goes back to the UK Palmerston government. They circumvent. Their government was circumventing what's known as the Bank Charter Act of 1844, which required gold and silver reserves. Basically, in England, they were lending out gold or paper claims on gold greater than the amount of gold they have. There was no there. It's typical bank run, and it caused a global panic. The U.S. economy would not recover until the Civil War, when it became a nationalized wartime economy where all economies do well. Sort of like the United States coming out of the Great Depression didn't end until World War II. Noticing a pattern?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you get wars when you need to distract from a bad economy. And when you nationalize an economy for wartime production, oh, there's money to be made. So Delano loses most of his fortune during that panic. And so what does he do? 1860, he goes back to Hong Kong instead of China and rebuilds his fortune, doing the exact same thing. And he actually would ship opium to the United States Army Corps Medical Corps during the war, during the Civil War, because they used opium for all kinds of medical treatments back then. That's pretty much it for him. He would die at the family mansion at a place called Algonac. And I did not grab a picture of that, unfortunately. I should have. In 1798.
So let me add a few other tidbits into this. So as you mentioned, he was in Canton, but he spent a lot of time, actually lived in Macau, which everybody knows is the heart of corruption of China. That's where the casinos are. That's where all of the dark activities. And he spent a fair amount of time in Macau. As a matter of fact, that's where his family was, including his brother Edward, as part of the opium trade. The name of his bungalow that he lived in was referred to as the Rat's Retreat. And in personal letters back to the family, he described, and this is actually a quote, pale, cadaverous, death-like as attributes of the opium addiction throughout China. So they knew exactly what they were doing to these people in delivering opium into China. And also, where's that other part? The part you were just talking about when he returned back to regain his fortune. It also says that his family, specifically him, Junior, used part of that recouped fortune to fund institutions like Harvard and the U.S. Merchant Marine Academy, who actually has Delano Hall named after those contributions that he made.
Yeah, it's amazing. A guy who basically was or drug smuggler comes back to the States with a pristine reputation. And you know what happens with these old families? If there's any kind of a scandal, they send their lawyer to the newspaper and make sure it doesn't get printed, because we're now into the Gilded Age, and things like was the New York Herald and a few of the other tabloids. Well, if you could find dirt on one of these old families, you were going to sell a bunch of papers. And so you had to be paid off not to run the stories. And that's really how the Gilded Age worked with that. Anything else you want to say on him?
Nope.
I really should see if you can find a picture, if you can, of their family home, because that's interesting. It's called Algonac, Algonac. The tomb,
Spell it again, ALG.
ONAC. The tomb, the Delano family tomb where he's buried, it was designed by Richard Morris Hunt. The same guy that built all the Vanderbilt mansions builds their family tomb. So, thought that was interesting.
That is interesting.
Okay, get to our next guy, Franklin Hughes Delano. I think that's his brother. Why do we care about him? He is his brother. He worked in the various shipping businesses, and he's the guy who served as the U.S. consul for Chile in New York from 1840 to 51. The Chilean connection again.
Yeah.
He would marry a woman named Laura Eugenia Astor. Yeah, she's the daughter of William Blackstone Astor Sr. and the brother of the famous John Jacob Astor III. Blue blood families. And understand the Astor money was made in shipping as well. Theirs was probably more pristine than the Delanos. They were big fur traders, the Astors. But I don't think any of these shipping families didn't occasionally bring in some contraband. We just didn't find out about it because they paid off the reporters.
I sent you a picture of the house.
Yeah, I got it. I'll pull it up here. Well, let me pull it up right now. Give me 1 second. I'll stop the share so I can bring this over here. It's worth looking at since we do houses here. The tomb is pretty cool too. All right, let's get that up on screen briefly. That's not it. We'll have to get that later. I'm still taking up too much. We'll get to it.
Okay.
All right, let's go back to this share. So he marries into the Astor family and retires from the Delano family business just to work on managing the Astor properties. Becomes the president of several Southern railroad companies. And there's a wedding gift from the Astors where 100 acres of the Rokeby estate, or the Rokeby estate, it came to be known as Steen Vallece, which is like Stone Valley. He dies childless and ends up leaving the property to Warren Delano IV, who is who we're going to go to next. That's all the picture I had on him. He's interesting. He's born on Algonac, at that house we're trying to get a picture of. He's the son, obviously, of the opium smuggler, Warren Delano Jr. Funny story about him. When he's a kid, he was banned from his best friend Dick Aldrich's home for spiking the punch at a party. Aldrich is from the Aldrich family, cousins of Senator Aldrich, who is the namesake for Norman Aldrich Rockefeller and the guy whose train all the bankers took down to Jekyll Island in 1911 to give us the Federal Reserve. Those Aldriches. His mom is interesting too. Dick Aldrich's mom, that is. She was a descendant of the Winthrops and also the Astors. You know about the Winthrop family.
Yes.
But during the Spanish-American War of 1898, she is a nurse in the Red freaking Cross.
Of course she is.
Yeah. Yeah, I think a lot of them actually were good-hearted. But I don't know if there's anything wrong with what the nurses did, per se. And what else about Warren Delano IV? Oh, he ran coal businesses. They had a big coal empire, and that was his whole thing. If you go through Pennsylvania, there's something called the Ghost Town Trail. And about half those mining towns were ones that were run by Warren Delano's coal mines before they went out of business. And he was known as a gentleman horseman. Okay. His sister. is none other than Sarah Delano Roosevelt, born Sarah Ann Delano. That's a picture of her in Time magazine, 1933. And is she a character or what? This, of course, is the mother of FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and this is where we get the Roosevelt part of the name because she marries James Roosevelt I. Okay, she is born in Newburgh, New York. Spent several years in Hong Kong because her dad was running opium out of Hong Kong, so she spent a few years there.
Yeah, they took the whole family.
Oh, yeah. Interesting childhood, huh?
Yeah.
You ever watch the James Clavell made-for-TV movies of like Noble House, Taipan?
No.
That's exactly that's all about the founding of this trade in Hong Kong, and they're really well done, and they're great books. I read them all as a teenager. He was my favorite author most of my life, but it's real, pretty, I believe, realistic depiction of life in Hong Kong at that point in time, and it's fascinating. The different houses, you've got a mixture of Chinese culture mixing with European, and honor is so important. And these guys are all pirates, and they still have to act like English gentlemen. And then the Americans get involved, and absolutely great. You can find these books you can find the movies, made-for-TV movies on the internet pretty easily. So then she comes back to the U.S. and is home-educated, homeschooled. She marries at the age of 26. I'm sorry, at the age of 26. She marries a gentleman by the name of James Roosevelt I, who is actually 26 years older than her. So he's 52, she's 26. She gives birth in 1882 to Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and that's the only child she'll ever have because the doctors at the time said you should never have another baby. This has a big impact on her, so she becomes an incredibly devoted mother. Perhaps a little bit too much so, if you ask some people, including Eleanor Roosevelt, but that's complicated.
That's complicated.
Yeah.
Yeah, she's like what we call the helicopter mom.
She might have been one of the original ones.
Yes.
Well, let's just talk about that. She homeschools Franklin. When he goes to Harvard, she moves to Boston so she can be near him. She stayed by his side throughout his entire adulthood.
Yes.
Including when he went to the White House.
Correct.
Like I said, she had a complex relationship with Eleanor, who is actually Franklin's distant cousin, fifth cousin, I believe. A lot of the newspapers at the time called her domineering. She originally did not approve of Franklin's courtship of Eleanor. She actually had him keep it kind of secret for a year.
I think domineering is a kind word.
So 1906, they're married. So mom, Sarah Delano Roosevelt, commissions a pair of houses to be built side by side on East 65th Street in New York. Franklin Delano Roosevelt would live there until we moved to the White House in 1933, 27 years later. But she didn't build just one house, she built two. And she had connecting doors between the houses.
The first duplex on the block.
Yeah. If I had a mother-in-law like that, oh goodness. I've got the best mother-in-law I could have ever wanted. So I count my blessings.
I do too.
Let's see what else is there. Oh, she's really involved with the raising of Eleanor's children. Eleanor's not a weak woman by any stretch. I mean, well. So what happens is FDR has an affair with a woman by the name of Lucy Mercer. When that's discovered, Sarah is actually very supportive of Eleanor. And you say, oh, did she have a good side? No, she did not want to hurt FDR's political career. That was her motivation. She cared about his political career. Remember, their cousin, Teddy Roosevelt, was president of the United States until 1908. So the Roosevelt family has political ambitions. We'll get into that in a little bit because there's a rivalry. But let's talk about the affair. Who's Lucy Mercer? Her parents used to be wealthy, but they lost their fortune in the Panic of 1893. Her dad would then join the army, and he was one of Teddy Roosevelt's Rough Riders when they battled the Spanish in Cuba. So Lucy became the secretary to Eleanor Roosevelt in 1914. A woman by the name of Alice Roosevelt Longworth, who's the daughter of Teddy, encouraged the affair. Remember, there is a rivalry between the two branches of the Roosevelts. So here's Alice basically sticking her nose into the marriage. The affair gets discovered in 1918. Eleanor offers, I'll offer you a divorce. And Sarah comes in and says, that ain't happening. If you do that, Franklin will lose his entire inheritance from the Delanos. And that's a lot. And basically, to save his political career, Lucy Mercer broke it off, allegedly. She marries a guy by the name of Winthrop Rutherford. Now, he's an interesting gentleman because that wasn't his first proposal. His first proposal was to Consuelo Vanderbilt. Yeah, the dollar princess that would marry into the Churchill family. That was more attractive to the Vanderbilts than marrying Mr. Winthrop. But Mr. Winthrop did think it was okay to marry Lucy Mercer. While they're married, Lucy stayed in touch with FDR. Depending on which version of the story you believe, the affair continued. There's also talk that Eleanor and FDR never slept in the same bed again, and they were basically just political business partners.
Yeah, and the Vanderbilt is the one that was held prisoner until she married the European royalty as well.
Yeah.
Cornelia. So Mercer actually, like you said, she worked for Eleanor, but she also worked for FDR when he was over at the Navy Department.
Winthrop dies in 1944, and they resumed their affair openly, apparently. Oh, not too openly, because it wasn't really discovered until 1966. And she was actually by FDR's side when he had his fatal stroke. So that's Lucy Mercer for you. Sarah Delano Roosevelt would die in 1941 with FDR at her side. I don't want to do Eleanor right now. We can talk a little. I don't have too much on her because she's such a well-known figure. We may be able to have time for her at the end, but let's keep going on the Delanos.
Yep.
Okay. Where am I going? This is Jane? Yeah, that's what I want to do. How's that look?
That's good.
Jane Arminda Delano, 1862 to 1919. She was born in France, in a place called Sévenay-Loire at Atlantique. She studied nursing at Bellevue Hospital School of Nursing. She would treat victims of yellow fever in Florida in 1888 and got a reputation as a very good administrator. She spends 3 years nursing typhoid patients in Arizona. She becomes the superintendent of nurses at the University Hospital in Philadelphia. Then in 1898, the Spanish-American War breaks out, and she becomes a member of basically she founds the American Red Cross Nursing Service. Why does the Red Cross keep popping up in these stories?
Well, we know why.
Yeah, but this woman appeared to be a very legitimate nurse. I mean, all the things she's done. She actually dies in 1919 in France, fighting the Spanish flu, and she died of Spanish flu. So she's been out there for yellow fever, typhoid, and the Spanish flu finally got her. So I'm going to give her a. I think she's probably a good
Legitimate.
heart. Yeah, good soul.
Well, you have to have those as your cover story for doing nefarious things. So,
Okay, and that brings us to Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the next generation from the Delanos. And of course, his wife, Eleanor Roosevelt, the first chair of the Presidential Commission on the Status of Women. I don't want to go too deep into FDR and Eleanor. The one thing I did want to point out is FDR had a very big feud with Winston Churchill. They did not like each other. That's a whole video in and of itself. FDR's presidency. We'll go in it. We'll do the high level. I'm not a fan of his social practices, but let's jump to the Roosevelts now. Where are you, Roosevelts? The Roosevelt family tree. All right, the first Roosevelt to hit the American shores is a Claes Martensen von Rosenvelt. Got here in 1626. Or sorry, he's born in 1626, arrived in New Amsterdam around 1640. Colonel Wills, where's New Amsterdam? That's Manhattan.
Yeah.
How did it become a British colony? Do you know the story?
No, I don't.
Well, the Dutch owned the land, and they wanted a monopoly on a spice by the name of what is called nutmeg. It's now a household spice, but at the time it was worth more than its weight in gold. The Europeans were craving these spices. There's an island off of Indonesia called Banda Island of Run, and the Dutch traded with the English. They traded Manhattan for the island of Run, so they would have an international monopoly on nutmeg. Who do you think got the better end of that deal?
Well, how long did they have the island producing nutmeg as opposed to the revolution where they lost their island of Manhattan?
Yeah. I could go back.
I mean, Indonesia was a Dutch colony until the middle of the 1900s. So the Dutch probably ended up better off.
Perhaps, but I don't know. Manhattan. Well, I guess the point you're making is the British didn't hold on to Manhattan. So
Correct.
I get it. Yeah. It'd be an interesting economic calculation, and I am not going to waste everyone's time and try to do that on the show.
Okay.
So Claes gets there in 1640, and he buys a 50-acre farm in what is now Midtown Manhattan. His previous land is the site of the Empire State Building. And if you know New York City, this is pretty much Lexington and 5th, bounded by 29th and 35th Street. So some of the most valuable real estate in the world, and this family bought it probably for pennies. And that's how you get a old money, blue blood family with generational wealth that you will, you can never outgrow or outlive. Better be lucky than good, right?
Right.
His first son, Nicholas, was the first to spell. Oh, do I have a picture of Klaus? I think I do. Miraculously, there's a painting of him. That is the Dutch patriarch of the Van Roosevelts. Then we have his son Nicholas, who changes the name to Roosevelt, anglicizes it. And what's interesting about him is he was the first Roosevelt to be a politician. He's an alderman who was a big supporter, remember the British subjects at the time, of a guy by the name of Jacob Leisler. Why is he important? Do you know the name?
No.
1688 was something happens in England called the Glorious Revolution. Leisler is the guy who led that.
Oh, yeah, I heard of that, but I didn't realize that too led it.
Yep. That's how we got William of Orange, the Dutch prince, onto the throne of England. And it's also how we got the British Bill of Rights. And it's an incredibly important period. This guy was a big supporter of that. All right. His sons, Johannes and Jacobus, set up the two different branches of the Roosevelt family. These branches have a huge rivalry going back centuries. The one on the left is Hyde Park, and that's probably supposed to be a little bit more, I'd say Hyde Park's big Georgian mansions. It's more refined. This is the Democrat side of the Roosevelt family, which is where FDR comes from. This is surrounded by 1,500 acres of horses and farms. Oyster Bay is more rugged. This is Teddy Roosevelt's home. It's on 83 acres of Long Island. Like I said, more rugged, more rural, everything like that. That's the Republican side of the family. Now, we always say, the two birds of the same, two wings of the same bird.
Yes.
This is a yes and no, because these families, in the early 20th century, really, and even in the 19th century, really did have a rivalry at social occasions. You wouldn't get, you get snubbed socially. There was real animosity between the two, and that's why one of the Roosevelt daughters stuck her nose in FDR's marriage. So that's where this rivalry begins. All right, let's talk about FDR and Eleanor. Like I said, do we need to look at them? No, let's look at Oyster Bay and make it easier. Okay. FDR was born in 1882 to 1945. I talked about the feud he had with Churchill. It's a very long story, but reluctantly, they fought on the same side, but they saw a lot of things differently. FDR was in the New York Senate 1911 to 1913, becomes Assistant Secretary of War of the Navy during World War I. He's the VP candidate in a losing election in 1920 when the progressives got destroyed in the elections. And remember, I've said he was a progressive candidate. He's part of the Democrat Party, but they have very progressive policies. That was the end of the progressive era of politics. And we'll kind of see that his brother or his cousin Teddy actually was the first progressive president. So you got one Republican, one Democrat, but they're both progressives. How much of a difference is there?
Can I point out too that before you go on, that on the Roosevelt side, Anthony Sutton traces FDR obviously related to Theodore Roosevelt. He was also related to Martin Van Buren because he married Mary Aspinwall Roosevelt, and the wife of George Washington, Martha Dandridge, was among FDR's ancestors as well.
Excellent. I should have spent more time on some of those lineage sites, but they're cumbersome.
Well, basically, his conclusion was the Roosevelt family, the Delano Roosevelt family, was related to all but three previous presidents from when FDR took office. So huge. If there was ever an aristocracy in America, this family represents that.
As much as I love Anthony Sutton, and I think there's a lot of truth to that, I think he overstates the case, or perhaps draws too many thin connections. I've seen people rebut that work, and it's pretty credible, but some of it's true. I just don't think it's to the same degree, but I could be wrong. Sutton's a brilliant researcher. I think it's overstated. Fair enough.
Well,
but the point's valid.
Connections that the evolution of FDR is not without all of the ancestral precedents. He's not the down-to-earth kind of for the common man guy that he tried to make himself out to be. No,
indeed. And remember, he ran on a progressive ticket in 1920.
Can we talk about that in relation to his distant cousin real quick?
Go ahead.
His distant cousin is, hold on just a second, is a guy by the name of Clinton Roosevelt. And everything that WarHamster is going to talk about is not without precedent, because in 1841, New York Assemblyman Clinton Roosevelt wrote a document that basically outlines socialism. It literally encompasses every point of the 1984 quote unquote novel of George Orwell. And I wanted to read just a couple of points that he made. He presented this at a world conference that was hosted in New York City. And if you fast forward, which we'll get to, FDR's National Recovery Act, it was eventually struck down by the Supreme Court because it defied the Constitution. It was unconstitutional. But almost every point in that FDR National Recovery Act can be traced back to Clinton Roosevelt's presentation at that conference. And I just want to read a few of them.
Go for it. It's an important point.
Yeah, basically it says, whose duty, this was during the conference, whose duty will it be to make appointments? Because his whole presentation was that there needs to be an administrator, like an actual executive office that runs a socialized government. And that person, because this comes out in the Smedley-Butler controversy that's later revealed about FDR's proposition, he calls it a grand marshal who will be accountable that the men appointed are the best qualified, a court of psychologists, moral philosophers, and it says the grand marshal all of those appointees will be responsible to the grand marshal. Would you constrain a citizen to submit their final decisions to this selection board? He says they should all be reportable, and they're talking about literally a socialist ran government to the grand marshal. And then he goes on to delineate there's going to be a grand marshal of creation whose job it is to balance production and consumption. What is the duties of this guy? It is to estimate the amount to produce and manufacturers necessary to produce a sufficient amount to meet the needs of the country. How shall he discover what is excesses and deficiencies? The various merchants will report to him. They will determine, the board, the God, will determine the supply and demand of every line of business. Under the order of agriculture and manufacturing and commerce, what then is the duty of the Marshal of Agriculture? Under him should be 4 regions. Why 4 regions? Well, because there's a temperate, a warm, a hot, and a water region. And why divide them? Because it takes different products. And I mean, I could go on, but he's literally talking about a communist, socialist, Marxist type government under this grand master.
There's also some elements of technocracy being entered into what you just read. And I find that fascinating because American technocracy was at its peak under FDR and only disappeared after some of the dehumanistic policies of the Nazis, which were also technocrats, basically made the entire word sick to the stomach. So nobody talked about technocracy for another 80 years. But if everyone wants to have different names for what we're living under today, the technocrats have put themselves into every institution around the world, and they're being commanded by these secret society families that we've been talking about. And what you just read right there was an absolute roadmap for what became technocracy.
that's why I found this so important to this conversation, because this document was basically the Bible of the progressives. And it was used for the next, basically, kind of as a guiding principle. And it manifested itself in the National Recovery Act that FDR tried to pass after the war. It's as if, and keep in mind, FDR, as we're going to point out, had all of the backings of all of the families in New York City located at 120 Broadway for the most part, of the JP Morgans, of the Rockefellers, and all of those that funded the Bolshevik Revolution, funded Hitler for your left and right Hegelian dialect. And it's founded on these socialist principles. So I just wanted to point that out.
And I'll take it a step further. And obviously his descendant was FDR, but his other one, who was president of the United States, was Teddy Roosevelt, who was known as the very first progressive president during what's called the progressive era of politics.
Yes.
When he talks as vice president in 1908 to replace him, and that's William Howard Taft, skull and bones.
Yes.
1912 election, Taft's running again. Teddy isn't crazy about Taft's policies, his version of conservatism. So he runs as a third-party candidate to spoil the Republicans, to usher in Woodrow Wilson. One of the main reasons is Taft didn't want to sign the Federal Reserve Bank charter, which Woodrow Wilson did.
Yes.
But what's the name of the party? Everyone goes, oh, Teddy Roosevelt ran as part of the Bull Moose Party. Bull Moose? Bullshit. It was called the Progressive Party of America. Yes. So yeah, this is progressivism, which is a really soft way of saying socialism, which is basically the soft communism, which leads us to the technocracy and the international cabal wants to impose upon us.
And so, Clinton Roosevelt wrote the Bible.
I had enough time to check find some other things on Clinton when the colonel told me she wanted us to, because I had not originally wasn't going to highlight him. He was actually in Russia at the outbreak of the Crimean War. I'm reading this straight out of Wikipedia. And was employed as a this is in quotes, a diplomatic agent of the governments concerned, acting as the herald who carried the official dispatches between the cities involved, St. Petersburg, Paris, Vienna, and Berlin. Does that sound like a spy to you?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Got one more fun thing about him. And I'll read this again from Wikipedia. And so consider the source, all right, people? We use Wikipedia as a roadmap, but it's not always accurate. But this one I'm going to read anyway. He's long been the center of speculation and conspiracy theory. A guy by the name of Salem Kirban is often cited as the source for the claim that Clinton was a member of the Columbian Lodge of the Order of the Illuminati, described as having been established in New York City in 1795. And that fits the freaking pattern, don't you think?
Yes, absolutely. He definitely agreed with all of the principles, whether or not he was a member, and put them in writing and said them out loud.
That's right at the period where you've got Albert Pike doing the Scottish Rites Freemasonry stuff. And we're going to get to Scottish Rites Freemasonry here in the next couple of weeks too. So keep that little data point in mind. The 1800s are so overrated for its influence on this century. You know, it's all these pieces were put into place. All right, real quick, I found the house that you sent me with the Delano house. I was able to get it up on screen finally. Little blue. Oh, wait, that's FDR's. Hang on, here it is. Boy, I am a rookie. Stop share, share again. Here's that grainy picture. Looks like a pretty good size house. Very.
It was huge.
Yeah. All right, it's enough of that. Enough looking at houses. We got some people to talk about. So we're still talking about FDR. A little bit more on him. Gets his legs paralyzed in the 1920s, so that's why he spent the rest of his life in a wheelchair, which makes his affair interesting to me. Won't go into detail on that question. Becomes governor of New York from 1929 to 1932. Becomes president. And of course, he signs the New Deal and all that garbage that we do not want to go into because it would take forever and I'll end up yelling.
Well, I also want to point out a little bit about before he gets to, um, just so that people can understand his background, because a lot of people don't understand some of his initial jobs as being involved in the banking industry. He had an office and a law firm in the building where all of the elites, where the Federal Reserve was located in New York. And one of the most interesting facets of his early Washington, D.C. time was his working for this bond company that was headquartered in Maryland. And he basically opened their office. And one of the points that you've made is almost all of his relatives have served time in the New York Assembly, the New York, many of them were state senators. He was the New York governor. And this bond industry, he made a killing. As a matter of fact, his first year, the bond company that he represented, increase in gross sales of bonds was $3 million. So back in this time, that's a lot of money. And the way he did it was his political influence. So basically, he would go to, for those of you who don't know, anybody that does business with a state entity, a county, a city, has to have bonds for the work they're doing. And so what he did was he leveraged his political influence and his family connections that basically said, if you want to do business with this particular city or this particular state, I would highly encourage you to buy bonds from my company because I have influence over who gets the contracts, because my relative works here or they're financing the product. And if you don't buy bonds, you're not going to get the contract. And he was very well known for that period of time in leveraging political influence because he had the backing of the JP Morgans, the Rockefellers, and everybody else.
Yeah, and the other small correction, because he didn't have the backing of everybody else, because there were some other families that did the business plot and tried to overthrow him in 1934, and that's the Major General Smedley Butler's story.
Yes,
that would have been the Prescott Bush. Yeah, the Prescott Bush is there. Yeah,
yeah.
So that really illustrates the global Game of Thrones that these power players play. They're all played by one set of rules that's above everybody else. And, they're up there playing this game, but they're always shifting for their own power, and they don't. I think if any one entity gets too much power, the rest will gather to take them down, and I think that's what we've seen over the centuries. But that one right there is a really good illustration of, something we've talked about a ton. Yes. All right, let's get into Teddy. Let's throw my screen up.
Your house is still there.
Yep, I wanted that. Then we'll go to Teddy. Hope I'm not making anybody dizzy with all this jumping around.
No, we're good.
All right. Theodore Roosevelt. Up there on Mount Rushmore. People talk about putting Donald Trump up on Mount Rushmore. And I say, and make him the fifth head. I go, no, why don't you take off the two that don't belong? And that would be Lincoln and Teddy Roosevelt. And I'm not going to go 100% into why, because that'd be a 2-hour show. But I am not a fan of Teddy Roosevelt because he's a progressive. So he is born in 1858 and is a bit of a sickly kid. and this is why he adopts this strenuous lifestyle. He was homeschooled, and then he went to Harvard. Writes a book about the Naval War of 1812. And that's interesting because he never served in the Navy, but later on he would become an assistant secretary of the Navy in 1898. And that was basically because he had a scholarly background. But this guy's a true outdoorsman. The rough, rugged thing about Teddy Roosevelt, that appears to be very accurate. He even runs a ranch out in Dakotas for a few years. Comes back to New York, and he is the leader of what's called a reform faction of the Republicans in the New York State Legislature. This is in the 1890s. Remember I told you the radical Republicans are very corrupt? Here's Teddy Roosevelt trying to form a reform faction of less corrupt Republicans. That's a check mark on the good side for him. He becomes the Assistant Secretary of the Navy appointed by McKinley in 1898. Did that for a brief time, and then he resigns and forms the Rough Riders, who then fought against the Spanish in Cuba. And we had a Delano earlier that was on one of the Rough Riders. Kind of interesting, huh?
Yeah.
So this is going to be one of the fastest political rises to power we've ever seen. This is 1898. He goes from Assistant Secretary of the Navy to forming the Rough Riders, comes back to New York in 1898, because he wasn't even there for a year. He got his reputation in about 2 months worth of work, and becomes governor of New York in 1898, a position that his cousin, FDR, would later hold. So his guy becomes so famous so quickly that McKinley chooses him to be his vice presidential running mate in 1900. McKinley gets assassinated, and all of a sudden, Teddy Roosevelt is the president of the United States at the age of 42 years old, the youngest ever. He is the leader of the progressive movement. He offered up something called the Square Deal. We're going to offer you a square deal. And FDR would come around later. I'm going to give you a new deal. So is that part of the rivalry? Your history book will tell you about he was really into trust busting. But I've already talked about this a bunch. He did not bust the trust. What they did is restructured as modern day corporations, limited liability corporations. The monopolies and the cartels are still here to this day. Rockefeller is still the richest family. But he gets credit for busting the trusts, the money trusts, which our friend Dr. D Program over on Twitter has done a great job of talking about the money trusts.
Yep.
And that's where that term comes from. We talk about how he regulated the railroads out of existence because they were replaced by the automobile. No railroads have made money since without government subsidies. There's an interesting part of his platform. He wanted pure food and drugs, predecessor to the Food and Drug Administration, FDA. Talk about how the Rockefellers were friends with the Roosevelts. That's what led into their monopoly on petroleum-based pharmaceuticals, which is a story we've told ad nauseum. Here's what he really gets me, is he's a big conservationist, air quotes. We had a Delano who's basically created Yellowstone. We love Teddy Roosevelt. He created all these national parks, allegedly to preserve our natural resources, perhaps to monopolize them. My question for you, Colonel. I am holding up a pocket constitution. Where should I look to find the part that gives the United States government the permission to own land of anything besides military bases and post offices?
Nowhere in the Constitution. Completely unconstitutional.
100%. Everything he did was unconstitutional. If you go to my Rumble channel, people, and you want to hear all the details about that BS, I did a video sometime about 9 months ago called Federal Land Grab with Alan Myers, and we went through this whole topic in detail. And it is a big deal because you get states like Utah that basically the U.S. government owns something like 80 or more percent of the land in the state. And that's not the way it's supposed to be, people. So I don't like Teddy Roosevelt because of this one. Can I get off my soapbox on that?
Well, let me add to the part about the trust busting, because as you pointed out with the Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act, it's giving extra constitutional powers to the executive branch that, again, is nowhere in the Constitution. You could not have the quote unquote trust busting without the regulation piece of it, because the regulation piece was going to be the foot in the door to picking winners and losers, so that you put so many regulations in place that it is almost impossible to compete with the corporate giants. And so what they are doing is strangling the individualism and the free market under the guise of busting up monopolies, which we now know they didn't do at all.
I just noticed that the Rumble, no, great point, by the way. Thank you. And I 100% agree. I just noticed that the Rumble chat isn't coming through on the StreamYard. So I missed a bunch of comments. So I apologize for that. I just went and looked at Rumble to see that. Yeah, Teddy Roosevelt needs to get sandblasted off that. He turned this country into something it was never supposed to be. And to have him sitting there next to Washington and Jefferson pisses me off almost as much as having Lincoln up there. And I'm not going to do a Lincoln. I'm not going to go off on Lincoln today, but that's coming. So, all right, what else do we have on him? He had a big focus on Central America, and he's the guy that basically gave the orders to build the Panama Canal. And the Colonel and I have talked about ad nauseum. This is where we talk about banana republics. He's all part of that. Interesting. We already talked about how he screwed over Taft and got Wilson in office. He would end up criticizing Woodrow Wilson for keeping the U.S. out of the war, out of World War I. He wanted to be in the war. You want to add anything on Teddy? Because that's all I really wanted to do. I mean, he's been talked about enough in history. He's a household name. We're not going to dig up anything too much more.
Yeah, no, I do think he was one of the original manufacturers of our progressive foreign policy in the kind of the globalist aspect. He was one of those that was a big champion of that.
Yeah, big government. Screw the Constitution. Screw you, Teddy. Let's move past you. He's got a son, Kermit Roosevelt. There's going to be two Kermits. We're going to do this first one quickly because the Colonel and I are going to have some fun with the last one. We might go a little long today, it looks like. Is that okay?
Yeah.
We just have two more names. I just have two more names. This is why I didn't want to spend any time on Eleanor. All right, Kermit Roosevelt, born in 1916, son of, sorry, that's the wrong one. Kermit, born in 1889, the son of Teddy. Goes to Harvard. He worked for National City Bank, my old employer, in Buenos Aires, Argentina. More South American connections with these people. Kermit would actually serve in both world wars. And you can see on the picture, he's from Oyster Bay, part of the family. Interestingly enough, he had a lifelong depression and would commit suicide while serving in the Army in Alaska at the end of World War II in 1943, actually. So why is Kermit didn't sound like that exciting of a life? Well, because his son is, of course, come on. Kermit Roosevelt Jr. And he's actually born in Buenos Aires in 1916 because his father was fighting World War I and was down in South America for some reason. Well, I'll do the quick overview, but the Colonel's going to have an awful lot of detail to fill in here, so I'm going to go quick. He's born in Buenos Aires, grew up in Oyster Bay, goes to school at something we've featured quite a bit, one of the Ivy League grooming schools known as the Groton School, because of course he did. How many CIA connections do we have there?
A lot.
Then he goes to Harvard, ends up teaching history at a place called Caltech. You run into Caltech in your research at all?
Yes.
CIA breeding ground?
Yes.
Well, he joins the OSS. And while he's there, he wrote and edited the OSS history. It's a pretty interesting position to be in.
Well, especially if you want to craft history.
Yeah. He, post-war, this is interesting. He serves on an advisory board called the Institute of Arab American Affairs in New York City. This is mostly an Arab.
Iran.
Well, very much. We'll get and Egypt, but we'll get there in a second here.
Yeah.
He wrote about American Zionism and the partition of Palestine. He's a pro-Arab guy. In 1948, he joins a quote-unquote Christian group to fight to reverse for the partitioning of Palestine into separate states. He kind of co-founds something called the Committee for Justice and Peace in the Holy Land. He's the executive director. His vice chair is none other than Skull and Bones and CIA alumni Henry Sloan Coffin, who we've talked about.
Yeah.
1951, he co-founds something called the AFME, which is the American Friends of the Middle East, which is part of an Arabist propaganda effort funded by the CIA and Aramco. 1950, he gets recruited to the CIA by none other than Frank Wisner and gets assigned to Egypt. I'm going to pass the ball over to the Colonel because we're going to do Egypt and Operation Ajax, and then I'll take us home.
Well, I would actually venture to say that there's no gap in his actual intelligence service from his OSS days to the CIA, that all of the stuff that he did was in service to them during that time.
I'll take that argument. Yep.
Yeah. So if you, I just finished reading a book about Frank Wisner's life, and all of the controversy that people want to say about what happened in Iran is completely discombobulated to the facts. So before Operation Ajax and the overthrow of Mossadegh in Iran, done with Kermit Roosevelt Jr. as the lead CIA person. I just recently found out that Kermit was intimately involved in setting up stay-behind units under the auspices of Operation Gladio, using a military advisory group in the southern part of Iran. They had went into the tribal areas and basically trained them to be Gladio cells. They had worked with the tribal leaders down there in preparation for the destabilization. And we know that the intelligence service was responsible, MI6 specifically, for bringing the original Shah to power in Iran, working on the Iranian oil fields. And in the lead up to Mossadegh's election, they're down creating the foot soldiers in the South that they're going to use. So they're doing it in conjunction with MI6. And MI6 orchestrates the first attempted coup of Mossadegh. And when that fails, Mossadegh basically kicks all of the British embassy people out, all of the MI6 agents that they knew about out of the country. So they have to come hat in hand to the US to ask for assistance. And Frank Wisner selects Kermit Roosevelt Jr. to create a plan to overthrow Mossadegh. And without going into a lot of details, because I've covered this on my own channel, the Reader's Digest version is they go in using the foot soldiers they've already trained to create chaos, all under the guise of anti-communism. And if you look at the total number of people that was in the Tudeh Party, which is supposedly this big threat that's going to implement communism any minute in Iran, you find out that it made up less than 1% of the entire population of Iran. It was never a threat, but they produced intelligence that basically said it was. Although there is corresponding, if you dig deep enough, that has now been declassified that actually states the problem, in that there's no way in hell did any of them actually believe that it was a problem, but they were going to use it as the excuse that Mossadegh was communist leaning and that he was a threat and he had to be taken out. So at one point, right up until the day of so they launched this overthrow, and it's initially not going very well. And Frank Wisner tells Kermit Roosevelt to cut it off. And he decides that he's going to disobey Frank Wisner's direction. And he gathers in some prominent people and relaunches it. And the second time they did it, it was successful. And they basically imprisoned Mossadegh in his house, where he eventually died. He was never allowed any freedom after that. And they reinstall the Shah. And so Kermit Roosevelt, and that's not the only operation he did. He did a lot. He operated for the CIA, like you said. And I find it very interesting, his position in Egypt, because what happened in Egypt? Egypt was a place where a lot of the Nazi scientists went to create missiles and rocket technology. And it was Otto Skorzeny who went in there and basically was hired by Israel to eliminate the Nazi scientists. And people, kind of like, well, wait a minute, wasn't he a Nazi? Yes, he was, but he was a mercenary at heart. And you could hire Otto Skorzeny to go anywhere and do anything. And Kermit Roosevelt knew and worked with Otto Skorzeny. And so his being in Egypt is very interesting in light of all of the moving pieces of Operation Gladio.
Very much so. You tied a lot of pieces together there at the end. Little side note, or the end note on Kermit. How does he end his career? Well, 1954, Allen Dulles asks him to lead the CIA coup in Guatemala.
Yes.
Roosevelt refused, and the official narrative of this is, he says that Ajax, this is for his own words, he said that Operation Ajax had succeeded because the CIA's aims were supported by a lot of Iranians. This is not the case in Guatemala. The colonel just told you that it probably wasn't supported by a lot of Iranians. Anyway, that's why he said no. He leaves the CIA in 1958, rides off in the sunset, and what do you think he does? He works for American oil and defense firms. Got his payoff at the end. Military industrial oil complex.
But I would argue he was there still in the role of a spy.
When he's working for the oil interests, if he's doing anything
absolutely.
international, yeah, his network's still going to be intact, but now he's getting paid to do it. So
correct. Because you find that, and I would also suggest that Kermit Roosevelt knew unequivocally that his mission almost failed. And he had a success under his belt. And he knew there was even more opposition in Guatemala and didn't want to tarnish his successful reputation of having succeeded in Iran, and wasn't going to chance it in Guatemala because he almost failed.
Well, as we know, Guatemala did succeed.
Yes.
A couple of times, but
couple times.
Anyways, ladies and gentlemen, those are your Delanos and your Roosevelts, just the nice blue blood families that the oligarchs who just happen to have been walking the corridors of the White House longer than just about anybody.
And I would close with opium, Kermit Roosevelt. Those are your bookends. So Kermit Roosevelt's covert operations continued through all of that time to be funded by Chinese opium, Shanghai Shek, and all of the fallout from his patriarchal affiliations with opium.
Yeah, you're also going to find a lot of modern day descendants of the Roosevelts, although they're scattered pretty far and wide. A lot of successes in startup companies in tech and biotechnology. We know a lot of these tech companies come from DARPA and other CIA related. So I don't know if the family ties are still going on or not, but they have done quite well in the venture capital space. Obviously, we don't have time to get into all of those, but these family bloodlines continue to this day.
Correct.
You don't hear about them as much, but they are there. Some of them have deliberately gone out of the limelight, gotten into things like the arts, and some of them built legitimate, musical careers. But this is the heart and soul of these two families and how they've crisscrossed throughout history with some of our other great, great families. That's all I got.
All right. Well, that will conclude another session of Secret Societies literally meets Operation Gladio. Probably.
And I am not even going to tell the Colonel what we're doing next week and the week after, because I want this one to be a surprise. But you're going to want to see it, because I'm probably more excited to put this next two presentations together than I ever have been. So looking forward to that.
I can't wait. And he does not tell me. So he did tell me ahead of time that we were doing the Delano and Roosevelt family, but he's kept me completely dark into next week's show. So really looking forward to that. Take care, everybody. Have a nice weekend, and we will see you here next week, Thursday at noon. Take care.
Cheers.